Jason had imagined his move to Willow Creek as the fresh start he desperately needed. The neighborhood brochure boasted tree-lined streets, well-kept sidewalks, and a so-called friendly community spirit. After years of city noise, endless traffic, and cramped apartments, he craved peace, a place where he could finally plant the native garden he'd always dreamed of. The vacant lot next to his modest new home, purchased as part of the deal, was his blank canvas. He envisioned wildflowers, tall grasses, and fruit trees swaying in the breeze, a personal oasis, but the dream began to sour the very first morning. Jason was unpacking his tools when he noticed the woman. She stood on the sidewalk, motionless, arms crossed over her chest. Her perfectly styled blonde bob didn't move in the breeze, as if it were made of plastic. She wore an immaculate white tennis outfit, despite there being no courts in sight. The glare she shot at Jason could have cracked stone. Jason tried a neighborly wave. The woman didn't wave back. "Morning," he called, his voice tentative but polite. She didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her chin, scanned his yard, then his lot, and finally settled her gaze on him. Then she turned on her heel and marched away without a word. Later, when Jason introduced himself to an older man walking his dog, he found out who she was. "Oh, that's Karen," the man said, tugging at his leash as his golden retriever tried to sniff Jason's toolbox. "Karen Peters. She's head of the HOA? Or, at least, she thinks she is." "Just smile and nod. That's what the rest of us do." Jason forced a smile, but felt unease, not in his gut. Over the next few days, the tension built. Karen's morning walks turned into surveillance missions. She'd pause at the edge of his lot, pretending to check her phone while scrutinizing everything, where Jason stacked his gardening supplies, how long his ladder stayed leaning against the garage, even the color of his planters. When Jason started preparing the lot's soil, Karen stood watching so long it made his skin crawl. One afternoon, Jason found a typed letter folded on his porch. It was from Karen, or more officially, the Willow Creek HOA. The letter was full of legal-sounding phrases and complaints about excessive dirt piles, unsightly debris, and potential impact on community property values. The accusations were ridiculous. Jason's lot was cleaner than most backyards on the block, but it was clear what was happening. Karen didn't like that he was planning something she couldn't control. Still, Jason wasn't looking for a fight. He drafted a polite reply, explaining his plans and promising to keep the lot tidy. He even included a rough sketch of the garden he envisioned. Native wildflowers along the fence line, a small pond, fruit trees to the back. He slipped it under Karen's door that evening, hoping it might ease whatever tension she felt. But Karen didn't want peace. The next morning, as Jason knelt to plant the first of his seedlings, Karen walked by again. This time, she didn't pretend to check her phone. She stopped, stared him down, and smirked. "Don't waste your time," she said, loud enough for him and half the street to hear. "That lot's better off empty. Nobody wants to look at a jungle next door." Jason swallowed the sharp words that rose to his lips. He wiped sweat from his brow and forced himself to focus on his work. He reminded himself he hadn't moved here to battle nosy neighbors. But as he glanced up and saw Karen still standing there, watching like a hawk, he felt the first crack in his dream of a quiet life in Willow Creek. And deep down, Jason sensed something he couldn't yet explain. Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Jason was jolted awake by a sound so loud and unfamiliar it took him a moment to place it. A deep rumble, metal clanking, the hiss of hydraulics. He blinked at the clock. 6:12 a.m. The neighborhood was usually silent at this hour, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of sprinklers. He threw on a t-shirt, shoved his feet into his boots, and ran to the window. What he saw made his stomach drop. A massive dump truck was backing onto his lot. The driver, expressionless behind the wheel, shifted the truck into position as its bed began to tilt. A roaring cascade of coarse gray gravel poured out like a waterfowl swallowing Jason's carefully prepared soil. His seedlings, the mulch he'd spread the day before. All of it disappeared beneath the relentless downpour of stone. Jason didn't stop to think. He sprinted out the door, heart pounding, shouting as he ran. "Hey, what are you doing? Stop." The driver didn't respond either. He couldn't hear over the deafening roar, or he didn't care. By the time Jason reached the edge of the lot, the damage was done. The entire front section of the lot was buried under tons of gravel. The truck shifted gears, and with a final metallic groan, it drove off, leaving behind only dust and ruin. Jason stood frozen, his fists clenched, the weight of disbelief settling over him. It felt surreal. He had worked so hard, spent weeks planning and preparing, and in minutes, it was all destroyed. That's when he noticed her. Karen, standing on her porch, coffee cup in hand, watching it all unfold. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look confused. In fact, she almost looked satisfied. Jason's anger surged. He crossed the street toward her, his boots crunching over loose stone. "Karen," he called, trying to steady his voice, though it trembled with fury. "Did you have anything to do with this?" She sipped her coffee and lowered the cup with an infuriating slowness. "I'm helping," she said smoothly. "That lot was an eyesore. Figured I'd spare the rest of us from looking at your dirt. Patch gravel looks cleaner, don't you think? Jason stared at her, trying to comprehend the audacity. You can't just, you had no right. Karen gave a little shrug, as if the matter was already settled. The HOA supports improvements that keep the neighborhood beautiful. You should thank me. Jason felt his pulse race. This isn't an improvement. This is vandalism. Call it what you want, Karen said, already turning toward her door. I call it maintaining property values. If you really want to argue, take it up with the board, but don't expect them to side with you. She disappeared into her house, the door clicking shut behind her. Jason stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, staring at the disaster before him. The lot that had held so much promise now looked like a construction site abandoned mid-project. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some watching openly from their driveways, but no one said a word. The rage Jason felt was sharp and hot, but beneath it, something colder settled in. Resolve. Karen thought she'd won, that he'd give up and move on, but Jason knew better. He wouldn't yell, he wouldn't make a scene. He would think, plan, and hit back in a way Karen wouldn't see coming. This wasn't over. Not even close. Jason didn't sleep much that night. He sat at his kitchen table long after the neighborhood lights went out, the quiet hum of his refrigerator the only sound keeping him company. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw to the gray wasteland, where his dream garden had been. His mind kept circling back to Karen's smug face, the way she'd said, "You should thank me." But Jason wasn't the type to let anger make him reckless. He knew instinctively that outbursts would only feed Karen's narrative, the troublemaker new neighbor, disturbing their peaceful community. No, if he wanted to win this, he needed to be smart. So, as dawn approached, Jason booted up his laptop. The soft glow of the screen illuminated his tired face as he started researching. He pulled up the Willow Creek HOA bylaws and read every word, highlighting anything that might work in his favor. He cross-referenced county codes about property rights, landscaping restrictions, and nuisance laws. The deeper he dug, the more confident he became. Karen had crossed a line. What she'd done wasn't just neighborly interference. It was destruction of property, plain and simple. And then Jason found something that made him pause. A clause, buried deep in the HOA rules, one that described permissible pool landscaping and fencing. Jason read it once, then again, a slow grin spreading across his face. Karen's pool, the pride of her backyard, was in clear violation of multiple HOA guidelines. Unauthorized fencing height, exotic plants not approved by the board, deck additions. She'd hidden it well, shielded by tall hedges and clever positioning. But Jason had seen it during a neighborhood barbecue a few weeks back. The whole setup was technically illegal. Jason began documenting everything. He took photos of his gravel-covered lot, zooming in on his flattened seedlings and ruined soil. He snapped pictures of tire tracks from the dump truck, carefully capturing their path from the street onto his property. And from his upstairs window, using a zoom lens, he captured clear shots of Karen's backyard paradise, evidence of every infraction. He didn't stop there. Jason started logging Karen's behavior, to every time she hovered by his property line, every passive-aggressive comment she lobbed his way, every time she inspected his yard under the guise of an HOA enforcer. The more evidence he collected, the more focused he became. Days passed, and Jason kept up appearances. He waved at neighbors, kept his voice calm when Karen walked by with her daily smirk, and kept working at the edges of his lot, clearing what gravel he could, planting new seedlings where the damage wasn't as severe. But under the surface, his plan was taking shape. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows lengthened across the street, Jason stood at his window and watched Karen fuss over her pool deck. She had no idea what was coming, no clue that the very rules she used as weapons would soon turn against her. Jason didn't want revenge for its own sake. What he wanted was justice, a way to make sure Karen understood that actions had consequences. And if she insisted on playing these games, he was ready to play harder, smarter, and fairer. In the stillness of that night, Jason felt the tide shift. The first move had been hers. The next would be his. And this time, Karen wouldn't see it coming. Jason waited. Every day that passed, he watched Karen preen over her pool, water her exotic plants, and host small gatherings in her carefully concealed backyard retreat. From the street, no one could see the full scope of her violations. The tall hedges did their job. But Jason had the photographs, the measurements, the bylaw references. He knew her pool, deck, and landscaping were one big HOA infraction waiting to be exposed. But exposure wasn't enough. Karen had crossed a line when she destroyed his dream. Jason wouldn't stoop to petty revenge. No. He would deliver a lesson Karen wouldn't soon forget, and he'd do it in a way that left no doubt about who was in the right. It started with a quiet call to a local landscaping company, one Jason had seen working discreetly on late-night commercial jobs. They specialized in unconventional projects, and, for the right price, didn't ask many questions. Jason laid out his plan with careful detail. He wasn't asking them to damage property, merely to enhance Karen's backyard in a way she couldn't ignore. 2 nights later, under cover of darkness, the trucks arrived. Jason watched from his upstairs window, his heart pounding, adrenaline surging with every soft crunch of tires on asphalt. The crew moved with practiced speed and efficiency, headlights off, guided only by moonlight and small utility lamps that cast a faint glow on the worksite. Truck after truck backed down Karen's side driveway, the same path her gravel delivery had taken onto his lot, but this time, the gravel didn't stop at the edge of a garden. It filled her pool, ton by ton, turning the shimmering blue water into a pit of stone. The deck and patio were smothered. The carefully planted palms and flowering vines she'd cultivated to impress her guests were buried beneath the weight of rock. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the sky, Karen's backyard paradise had been transformed into a barren, gray, moonscape. Jason stood in the silence of his kitchen, sipping coffee and waiting. The scream came at exactly 6:47 a.m. It started as a strangled gasp, the kind of sound someone makes when they can't quite believe what they're seeing, then rose to a full-throated shriek that echoed down the block. Lights flickered on in houses up and down the street. Curtains twitched as neighbors peered out, trying to catch a glimpse of what had shattered the morning calm. Jason stepped onto his porch just as Karen burst through her back gate, wild-eyed and shaking. Her perfect hair was tangled, and she wore a robe that flapped in the breeze like a defeated flag. "You," she screamed, pointing at him with a trembling finger. "What did you do? What have you done?" Jason met her fury with cool calm. "Just helping," he said evenly. "That backyard of yours didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. I thought you might appreciate the upgrade." Karen's face turned ashen, then red with rage. She took a step forward, fists clenched, but Jason raised a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "I suggest you call the HOA, he said quietly. "See what they think of your backyard. Or maybe I should. After all, I've got plenty of photos and paperwork ready to go." For the first time since he'd moved in, Karen didn't have a snide remark or a smug smile. She stood frozen, the weight of Jason's words and the consequences of her own actions settling heavy on her shoulders. Jason turned and walked back inside, leaving Karen alone in the growing light of day. Her rock garden, a monument to the war she had started and lost the first real battle of. Jason could feel the tension crackle through the neighborhood like static. By mid-morning, Karen's backyard disaster was the talk of Willow Creek. Neighbors whispered on porches. Joggers slowed to stare at the sea of gravel where a sparkling pool had once been, and children on bikes pointed and gawked, but Jason didn't gloat. He stayed quiet, tending his ruined lot, as if the spectacle across the street was none of his business. Inside, though, he was ready because he knew Karen wasn't the type to back down, and she didn't disappoint. It started small. An official-looking letter slid under Jason's door that afternoon. The HOA, or more accurately, Karen acting as its self-appointed voice, accused him of unapproved landscaping activities, disrupting community harmony, and creating an unsightly nuisance visible from neighboring properties. Jason read it with a smirk. The hypocrisy dripped from every line, but what came next wasn't funny. The very next morning, Jason awoke to find a bright red sign staked in front of his house. "Violation pending fine, HOA action in progress." It was angled just so that passing cars couldn't miss it. The message was clear. Karen wasn't done fighting. Later that day, two men with clipboards appeared at his door, HOA inspectors. Supposedly, Jason invited them onto his porch, but refused to let them onto his property without a warrant or proper notice. Their vague threats didn't faze him. Jason knew the rules, and he could see in their eyes that they didn't have the authority they pretended to. Karen, meanwhile, was losing her cool. Jason saw her pacing in her yard, phone glued to her ear, gesturing wildly at the mess in her backyard. She was trying, desperately, to find someone who could clean it up, and fast. But gravel was heavy, and getting rid of it wasn't as easy as having it dumped. The removal would cost thousands and likely take days. But Karen's biggest mistake came that evening. Jason heard the sharp crack of wood snapping and hurried outside. There, in the waning light, he found Karen in his yard, tearing down his newly posted no trespassing signs, the ones he'd installed just that morning. Her face was flushed with rage, her hands shaking as she ripped the last sign from its post and threw it to the ground. "That's enough," she hissed. "You don't belong here. You're ruining this neighborhood." Jason took a slow breath, his heart racing, but his voice was steady. "Get off my property, Karen, right now." She froze, realizing too late that several neighbors had gathered at the commotion, watching silently, and then Jason lifted his phone and snapped a picture. Karen standing on his land, the broken sign at her feet, fury written all over her face. "This is trespassing," he said calmly, "and vandalism. I'll be adding this to my case file." Karen's expression faltered, just for a second, the first crack in her armor. Without another word, she turned and stormed back to her house, slamming her door so hard the windows rattled. Jason stood there in the quiet that followed, pulse thrumming, feeling the tide shift further in his favor. Every reckless move Karen made tightened the noose of her own making, and Jason, he was ready. The evidence was piling up, the neighbors were taking notice, and soon the HOA itself would have no choice but to face the truth. Karen had declared war. But Jason wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was building his case, stone by stone, and the final blow was coming. Jason knew it was time to shift gears. Karen had pushed things beyond neighborly squabbles. She had trespassed, vandalized, and weaponized the HOA, and Jason, he had been methodical, patient, and deliberate. Now, it was time to act. The morning after Karen's outburst, Jason drove into town and stepped into the office of a lawyer, whose name came highly recommended, Cynthia Blake. She was known for her sharp mind, ironclad cases, and zero tolerance for bullies masquerading as concerned citizens. Jason laid out everything: the photos, the letters, the gravel dump, Karen's trespassing, the broken signs, and even the HOA violations tied to her illegal pool setup. Cynthia listened, occasionally nodding, her pen scribbling fast notes. When Jason finished, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes gleaming with purpose. "She's cooked," Cynthia said simply. "We'll file for property damage, trespass, and harassment. And since you've documented everything, we'll seek restitution for your lot and punitive damages. I'll also demand that the HOA cease any action against you until this is resolved. Trust me, she won't see this coming." That same day, Jason's plan roared to life. By mid-afternoon, a formal letter from Cynthia's office was delivered to Karen's doorstep, stamped with official legal seals. The letter was clear. Jason was pursuing legal action, and Karen's every move was now under scrutiny. Karen's reaction was immediate and visible. Jason watched from his window as she tore open the envelope on her porch. Her confident smirk faded with every word she read. Her hands trembled as she clutched the letter, and for the first time, she didn't storm across the street to argue. She retreated into her house, slamming the door behind her. But Jason didn't stop there. Cynthia also contacted the HOA formally, submitting Jason's evidence and pointing out not only Karen's violations, but the board's failure to act impartially. The board couldn't ignore it now. They were legally on notice. Jason watched as HOA officials, clipboard in hand, finally made their way into Karen's backyard, inspecting her illegal deck, unpermitted structures, and the gravel-filled pool that stood as a monument to her own arrogance. For the next few days, Karen's world seemed to shrink. The HOA issued her formal citations. Contractors arrived to estimate the cost of gravel removal. Neighbors who had once politely tolerated her began to avoid eye contact or offer Jason quiet words of support. But the real blow came when Jason, accompanied by Cynthia, filed the lawsuit at the county courthouse. Word spread fast in Willow Creek. Karen was officially being sued. Jason didn't need to shout it from the rooftops. The mere filing was enough to change the atmosphere. Karen, once the queen bee of the block, now seemed small and isolated. Her grand plans to dominate Jason had backfired spectacularly, and everywhere she turned, she saw reminders of it: the empty stares of neighbors, the growing list of fines from the HOA, and the gravel mountain that mocked her from behind her. House Jason didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He kept working quietly on his lot, clearing the last of the gravel, planting again where he could. His actions spoke louder than any words. He was rebuilding, while Karen's empire crumbled, and yet, Jason knew the final twist was still to come. Karen wasn't the type to surrender easily, but as the legal machinery ground forward, one thing became clear. Her next move would either destroy what little remained of her standing, or seal her fate entirely. The lawsuit rattled Karen more deeply than Jason could have imagined. For the first time since he'd moved into Willow Creek, Jason saw fear behind her sharp glares. She no longer strutted across her yard or barked at passing neighbors. Instead, she kept to herself, blinds drawn, pacing her house like a caged animal. But Jason knew better than to believe the storm had passed. Karen wasn't beaten yet, and sure enough, the storm came. It started with strange noises at night. Jason would wake to the faint sound of scraping or the low rumble of an engine idling nearby. Once, he flicked on his porch light to see the tail end of a pickup speeding away down the block. Another night, he found tire tracks near his side fence, as if someone had tried to back a trailer onto his lot, only to think better of it at the last second. Jason tightened security. He installed motion-activated cameras and lights, and his phone buzzed with alerts whenever something moved near his property line. The footage showed what he expected: Karen lurking near the edge of his yard, or strangers she'd hired, people who disappeared the moment lights came on, or cameras caught them. But Karen wasn't done. That one humid night just before dawn, Jason awoke to the acrid smell of smoke, his heart pounding. He bolted to the window and froze. Flames licked at the corner of his garden bed, where someone had clearly tried to set fire to the debris pile he'd been clearing. Jason grabbed his extinguisher and raced outside, dousing the fire before it could spread. His cameras had caught everything: Karen, under a hooded jacket, creeping across his yard, striking a match, and fleeing when the first flickers caught. Jason didn't wait. That morning, he turned the footage over to Cynthia and the police. The case escalated from civil to criminal. Karen had crossed from petty harassment into dangerous territory, and now, the law wasn't just on Jason's side, it was coming for her. The police arrived at Karen's door that afternoon. Jason watched from his porch as she tried to play innocent. her voice shrill with denial. But when they showed her the footage, the fight drained from her face. She glanced across the street at Jason, her expression a mix of hatred and defeat. Before they led her to the patrol car, the neighborhood was eerily silent as they drove off with Karen in the back seat. No one cheered. No one said a word. The spectacle spoke for itself. The self-proclaimed enforcer of the HOA, the woman who'd terrorized Jason and countless other neighbors for years, was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Jason exhaled, feeling the tension of the past weeks begin to ease. But deep down, he knew this wasn't quite the end. There was still the lawsuit, the HOA's rulings, and Karen's inevitable attempts to claw back some scrap of dignity. Yet for the first time, Jason felt truly hopeful. The neighborhood had seen Karen for what she was. The law was on his side, and the property she'd tried so hard to control now stood as a symbol of her downfall. His lot, scarred but healing, and her backyard, still buried beneath tons of rock. The pool she'd once flaunted now, a forgotten relic. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that one more twist lay ahead, something that would put the final nail in the coffin of this bitter feud. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now filled the benches, eager to see how it would end. The HOA president sat stiffly in the back, as if hoping invisibility would spare him the embarrassment of being associated with Karen's mess. Jason sat at the plaintiff's table.com but alert, while Karen fidgeted across the aisle. Her expensive lawyer whispered urgently to her, but Karen's eyes darted between Jason, the judge, and the gallery. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Photos of the gravel dump, video of her trespassing, the shattered signs, and worst of all, the footage of her trying to set fire to Jason's lot. Her attorney tried to paint it as a misunderstanding, a moment of emotional instability brought on by neighborly tensions, but no amount of spin could erase the facts. Cynthia, as precise as a surgeon, laid out the timeline, the damages, and the patterns of harassment. She cited the HOA rules Karen had violated and even presented written statements from neighbors about her long history of bullying. Jason could see the shift as the case unfolded. The judge's patience for Karen's excuses wore thinner with each passing minute. The jury, where required, or the judge himself, depending on the court format, listened grimly, and Jason, he said little, letting the mountain of evidence speak for him. Finally, after hours of testimony, the decision came down like a hammer. Karen was ordered to pay for the damage to Jason's lot, not just the cost of gravel removal and restoration, but punitive damages for harassment and emotional distress. The amount was staggering, far beyond what Karen had expected. The judge further ordered her to cover Jason's legal fees and issued a restraining order. She was to stay well away from Jason's property and cease any form of contact. But the final twist came after court adjourned. As Jason stepped outside, reporters from local news stations waited, drawn by the spectacle that had gripped the neighborhood. Before Jason could say a word, a soft voice called his name. An older man approached, well-dressed but modest, carrying a briefcase. He introduced himself as a representative of a real estate development firm. "I've been following the case," the man said. "We admire how you handled yourself, and we're interested that lot of yours, the one Karen tried so hard to ruin. We'd like to make you an offer, full market value, plus a bonus. We see potential for something special there, a fresh start." Jason blinked, caught off guard. After everything, the war with Karen, the sleepless nights, the legal battles, here was an opportunity not just to recover, but to thrive. Karen, standing off to the side in stunned silence, overheard the exchange. Jason didn't have to say a word. The look on her face as she realized that, in trying to destroy him, she'd paved the way for his victory, that was justice enough. Jason shook the man's hand, sealing the deal that Karen had never seen coming. And as he walked away, past the news cameras and the murmuring crowd, he felt lighter. The battle was over. Karen's reign of terror had ended, not with a shout, but with a quiet triumph she couldn't undo. Her pool, still a rock garden, her reputation, shattered, and Jason, he left with dignity, strength, and a future brighter than Karen had ever imagined.